So much to talk about. The war between the Vatican and the Trump admin begins.
Astonishing that a letter like that telling people essentially that open borders are something you should seriously consider implementing for your country was issued by somebody who signed a document putting some draconian punishments for people who illegally enter Vatican City. A lot of bishops responded lightning quickly. It was as if they knew this was coming. And what is at the heart of the policy program? It's money. The United States has been the biggest giver of money to the Vatican. We're talking about billions upon billions of dollars. USAID was just the tip of the iceberg.
If the USAID cash cow gravy train is over, where do they get their money? How do they operate?
That's the $64,000 question. Where are they going to get their money from? Because the Germans can't make up most of it. I mean, have you seen the attrition rates in the Church in Germany? The U.S. bishops, if the typical Catholic isn't giving much money anymore, are we competing with, was it $5.2 billion?
By the way, my name is Joe McClane. I host a radio program called A Catholic Take, where we look at the world through a Catholic lens. I'd love for you to hang out with us. If you like it, give it a thumbs up and let us know what you think in the comments below.
So much to talk about. The war between the Vatican and the Trump admin begins, and it's getting very interesting to say the least. I do want to talk about the funding of USAID, but let me start with getting your commentary on the letter that Pope Francis issued just yesterday.
It's astonishing that a letter like that telling people essentially that open borders are something you should seriously consider implementing for your country was issued by somebody who signed a document a month and a half ago putting some draconian punishments for people who illegally enter Vatican City. I was astonished at how tone deaf this was.
Right.
Yes,
exactly.
I think the letter was coordinated with the U.S. bishops. Part of me thinks this wasn't even written by anybody in Rome, that this was written by an unnamed American cardinal who has, Pope Francis's personal email, sent it to him, and then had it okayed. Because the coordination, did you notice how many bishops and the various bishops' conferences in the United States, like Wisconsin was the one I used this morning in my live stream, but a lot of bishops responded lightning quickly. It was amazing how quickly they responded. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, individual bishops, it was as if they knew this was coming. And some of their statements were short, some were not so short, which is why I think this was coordinated.
What I love the most is just the profound hypocrisy of it. And it's not a new argument. This has been going on for a while now. Even during Trump's first administration, the whole argument over border security came up, and then the contrasting that with the Vatican City. I've been to Rome a few times. There's a massive, thick, very tall wall that surrounds Vatican City. And good luck, climbing, scaling this wall, sneaking through a gate or whatever, and trying to camp out in the Vatican gardens. It ain't going to go well for you. It's not just the guys with the spears and the feathered helmets that are going to come after you. It's the guys with the earpieces and the suits and the submachine guns under their jackets, because they have those too there. And they don't put up with intruders at the Vatican. This is why they have thick walls, and it goes back centuries. Why is there such a hypocrisy when it comes to border security? Good for thee, but not for me.
Well, it's if you look at the context of who the Vatican has allied itself with, really since the 60s, let's be honest with ourselves, if not earlier, but in the last decade or so, it's gotten really noticeable. The secular NGOs, NGO leaders, big money investors and things, and how they've all been together, working together on immigration, and meaning open borders policies and bringing people in from other countries. Several years ago, Cardinal Robert Sarah wrote in a book that it was to invoke the Bible to justify open borders and mass migration was satanic. And he was saying that in the context of what was happening a decade ago in Europe. And the Vatican was embroiled in that as well. If people forget that Brexit, part of what caused Brexit in the first place was open borders. That what looks like is going to topple the French government at some point is open borders. What's causing the so-called far right, meaning a centrist American-style Republican Party in parts of Germany, to rise up for the first time, any kind of right-wing party in Germany for the first time since World War II, is open borders. And yet you have the Vatican continuously invoking sacred scripture, somehow calling Jesus a migrant for moving one part of the Roman Empire to the other to participate in a census.
Right. Yeah, like no laws were broken in the process of traveling down to Alexandria, but I guess we're not.
Right, that means
to
this
pay
summer my family and I are migrating from here in Oklahoma to the Southwest American desert during the summer for a road trip, because that's what migration is now, right? That's what it is,
Right.
Because we're now just changing the definition of things for a policy program. And what is at the heart of the policy program? It's money. The United States has been the biggest giver of money to the Vatican. Put an asterisk next to that because we don't know how much China has given to the Vatican after the deal that they made with Rome for the so-called patriotic church there. We don't know what the details are of that. We probably never will know unless we get some people keep saying they want a Trump-style pope. I don't even know what that would look like, honestly. But
right.
If we get somebody dedicated to exposing things that have been going on for several decades in Rome, you might get the details of that deal that was made. But beyond that, it's the United States, and then it sort of fluctuates. Germany's usually number 2, sometimes South Korea for some reason. I guess the Catholics there tend to be well-to-do and give generously, but
really,
it's usually,
wow.
Yeah, European countries, Germany, right after the United States. Typically is how it goes. We give the most money, and that's not counting grant money. It's going to be the United States number 1, without question, for the grant money. Just if you see the USAID numbers that go to the various chanceries of the United States and the various nonprofits, if you understand that a Catholic nonprofit has to give a small portion of what they give to the chancery office, who has to give a tiny portion of what they get from any source to the Vatican, you start seeing how this money works. And we're talking about billions upon billions of dollars. USAID was just the tip of the iceberg. A lot of these migrant programs are housed in the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Homeland Security, some of them in the Pentagon. So when you see this, know these further audits that are coming. This is why you have the Democratic Party and the Democratic Party in LACE, meaning the American bishops, are all just foaming at the mouth at this stuff. They barely said anything about Nancy Pelosi receiving communion illicitly. They barely ever said anything about Joe Biden promoting abortion and transgenderism and all the rest of that stuff. They kept their mouths shut on that. But here, where the catechism is clearly on the side of J.D. Vance and on Donald Trump, they come down like the wrath of God. Now, why is that? The only explanation is it's money, because
and politics.
The laity don't give money anymore to the church. You may have noticed sometimes when the bishop's annual appeal comes around, your priest tends to mention it in the homily, and he talks about how you should really give to this, and the laity don't give as much money as we used to, and that's after 2 decades of predator priest scandals and all the rest of it. We don't give money as much as we used to. A lot of people give money to support the work of the church to tiny local nonprofit organizations that they know can be trusted to actually feed the poor, or crisis pregnancy centers, or they donate to a seminarian to help them pay their student loans off before they enter seminary, or whatever it is. They do those things, but they don't give their dioceses and their parishes as much anymore. And that's because of the Francis effect, as well as the McCarrick effect. When you have both of those things going on, so they have to get the money from somewhere. I think the timing of, when you look at the USAID numbers from the actual databases, and you see that the money exploded in 2021 when Joe Biden came in, which also happens to be when the bishops took our sacraments away from us, which also happens to have been in the aftermath of McCarrick. All of those things make sense. That's how you got to this place. And now they're reaping the whirlwind for what they've done.
Yeah. If you give billions of dollars to the Vatican, it's basically to ensure that they're going to turn a blind eye to your abortion policy, your, pro-homosexual marriage policy, your in vitro fertilization policy, and all the other policies
exporting those to the developing world.
Yeah.
Which makes it 10 times worse.
Yeah. Forbes, which I'll link to today, says that the number 2 biggest receiver of USAID funds was CRS, Catholic Relief Services. So your little box that you get to put pennies in every Lent, well, these people receive $30 billion. Let that sink in. With the B. With the B, okay? If I had 1% of that, we would crush the world with goodness. But we don't get a penny of those things. It's like, it kills me. I was lamenting over the weekend, like 6,500 journalists around the world. 30 countries received money from USAID. We didn't receive a single dime. It's like, oh, man, imagine what we would have done with that money. Like, why don't they give it to the good guys instead of the bad guys?
If you want federal funds, I have a way you can get federal funds.
Do you?
You need to start a weekly segment called The Catholic Argument for Sodomy, and then do a dead serious right out of James Martin's book, and you'll get federal funding. They'll love
and then all
you
of a
so
sudden,
much.
poof, all the money you could ever handle. See, it comes with strings attached, and it's that temptation, right, to the world, the flesh, and the devil. And it seems, and this is what I guess what gets me, because there's just, you got to make choices, right? Like, you got to choose whose team you're on. And it feels like too many in the hierarchy, something you and I've talked about many times, too many in the hierarchy, they just, if they're being honest, they just want what this world has to offer. They're not really aiming for the next, are they?
You could be forgiven for thinking that. The homilies that they and their priests give that are usually, I mean, what's the joke about a homily? It's dad joke plus 1,000-foot level happy-go-lucky version of the scripture you just heard. Plus, on top of the fact, there's the lectionary issue also, right? I mean, how many times have you ever heard of that? People talk about, well, if you actually look at the lectionary, the readings in there tend to be the easy ones, the kind of challenging, the most challenging ones for us in the modern world that brush up against our modern sensitivities aren't included in your lectionary, which is why it's actually a lie that in the ordinary form of the Mass, you get more scripture reading than in the traditional Mass. It's not true. You don't. You get a 3-year schedule, but you're not going to remember it because you don't hear those readings very often. So you should read the Bible on your own time and get all those wonderful, wonderful indulgences that come with reading the Bible for 15 minutes a day. You get those under the normal conditions. But you combine this sort of nice guy version of Catholicism they've been pushing down our throats or combine that with the bishops who don't challenge the powers that be until mysteriously the charitable funds that they were getting dry up, get cut off, and all of a sudden they're getting implicated, at least by proxy, not necessarily directly, in human trafficking. Again, when we're talking about children who are missing and the likely fate that at least some of those kids have, on top of the elephant in the room for the last quarter century, really the last half century, let's be honest, Catholics, people watching this, cradle Catholics watching this who are older, will know that in the 80s you heard stories about predator priests. I, who was not a Catholic in the 1990s when I was in high school, rock bands I listened to sang about predator priests. Everybody knew, even in the 90s, this was going on. But it was in the early 2000s that it got blown up into the media for political reasons, as some have pointed out. That looms large over all of this. It's a really ugly look that they're facilitating this stuff with that legacy hanging over us.
If this much money is at stake, people have killed for far less. So if there's this much money at stake, I think it's going to be a fight to the death, in my opinion. I wanted to point out that I had Tara Rodas on the show, I guess about 5 months ago now, and she was a whistleblower. She testified to Congress about the tens of thousands of children who went missing as a result of this horrible border policy and immigration policy under the Biden administration that is now trying to be corrected. People like Tom Homan, Catholic, who are trying to correct it despite the pushback of His Holiness Pope Francis in his recent letter to say, hey, it's not right, it's not right. Well, listen, tens of thousands. And I look at this video, hardly anybody watched this video. It's not a fun topic. Nobody wants to hear about that. Thousands and thousands of children being molested and hauled off into human sex slave trade. But it's a reality, and it's happening under our watch. And people like Tara Rodas are brave enough to say so. We must put an end to it. And we must not just sit here and pretend as though false charity is true charity. It is not. Dr. Anthony Stine is on the team today from Return to Tradition. Dr. Stine, welcome back. It seemed to me that under Pope Francis's pontificate, there was an increasing trend of fewer and fewer donated dollars from American Catholics going into the basket, especially in light of some of the scandals, CCHD, for instance. If I recall correctly, more and more Catholics were kind of getting fed up with the scandals, and they just stopped putting so much money in that basket. If the USAID cash cow gravy train is over, at least for this next 4 years, where do they get their money? How do they operate?
That's the $64,000 question. Where are they going to get their money from? Because the Germans can't make up most of it. I mean, have you seen the attrition rates in the church in Germany?
Right.
Because of the German church tax system there, where your tithe is given to the government and then given to the churches, and you have to register as a Catholic with the government, which You think with their history, they might be a little askant, that viewed such things with a little suspicion, but hey, whatever. But they lose 250,000 Catholics a year or more. They just apostatize. And so they're the best numbers on how bad this situation is in the West. So that number is going to have to, by default, shrink as they get fewer and fewer Catholics, as the heretical bishops in Germany drive more and more people out of the church. You have to wonder where they're going to get the money from. And we know they're already suffering. I mean, before they tried to cancel Cardinal Burke by taking away his pension or whatever it was, that would, the money he gets as a cardinal for keeping an office. They called it an apartment, but it's an office where he sleeps in the back room every night, right? He used that money to cover the costs of that, to pay his professional staff. They tried to take that away from him, and they preempted that by warning all the cardinals that they were going to be having to pay out of their own pocket for their rent in Rome. And the only one they tried to do that with was Cardinal Burke. But the threat itself kind of does point to something, that they are financially in the squeeze in Rome these days. And we know this about other things too. They've mentioned the need to do better fundraising and to tighten their belts and all sorts of things. We know that fewer people are visiting Rome, the Vatican in general, as tourists, that the lines aren't as long as they used to be. How many pictures have we seen of the Holy Father giving an Angelus address, and to a mostly empty piazza? How many times have we seen those pictures? There is a cascading effect, and it's not just the United States. They're going to have to come up with money, and this is why some people speculate, and I use the word speculate here to emphasize that the Chinese gave a few $1 billion to the Vatican for the deal for to basically sell out the underground church. You don't know about all that. For anybody not familiar with that, it's an insane diabolical deal they made. Nobody can figure out why they did it, but essentially the Chinese Communist Party gets to choose bishops, put them in power themselves. Maybe they'll let somebody from Rome come and consecrate them, and their parishes have pictures of dear leader instead of like Jesus in them. I mean, it's just weird stuff.
Right.
Like people debate about whether certain masses are valid or not. The masses in China are probably not valid unless you're going to an underground mass. And the Catholics in China going to underground masses face real persecution at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. And yet Cardinal Zen got famous for resisting this, to the point where he actually went to jail for a while.
You remember how he snuck out? Talk about refugee status, immigrant status. Remember how he snuck out of Hong Kong to come to the Vatican in hopes of getting an audience with His Holiness, and sat in St. Peter's Square hoping and praying he would get an audience, and never got one as a refugee. And he had to go back to his country facing prison, as a consequence to his actions. And His Holiness didn't have time to visit with Cardinal Zen. I mean, that's the most insane, hypocritical thing I've ever heard. He's got time for Biden. He's got time for Pelosi. He's got time for all kinds of people. And he's the Pope. He should. But not Cardinal Zen seems crazy to me.
Mm-hmm. It's all a bigger picture as to why they are so obsessed with money. For the U.S. bishops, if the typical Catholic isn't giving much money anymore, and even if we were giving money, are we competing with, was it $5.2 billion since 2009? Are we, in terms of the tithes that we would be giving? Are we competing with the $2.9 billion since 2021, which is what that's from USAID through Catholic Charities. Are we able to compete on that scale? The answer is no. This is why Cardinal Dolan, who just retired, stepped out and said, it was such a evil thing people are saying that we only do this for money. We aren't making any money on this. I'm like, you might not be making a profit off of this, but there is the way it works with the sort of the diocesan taxes on things. This is not exactly an insignificant line item on your budget either. You're in Operation Survival mode. You don't realize it because you think you can just keep this revolution in the church going, this lukewarm liberalization of the church going, until people finally stop fighting back and decide they're going to keep going to mass for some reason that you can't quite enumerate, because they forced cultural change on the church, not just liturgical change. They forced cultural change on the church. And they did that over the past few decades, and people stopped going. Remember that cell tracking data? I've brought this up with you before. There were some groups who were doing what's called geofencing, where they can take an area and they can start looking at the number of cell phones at a location. And they can start doing that over the course of time and see how many people are going. And they started figuring out that only something like 5% of Catholics in the United States go to mass every Sunday. we can increase that by a percentage or two because not everybody, a lot of Catholics don't bring their cell phones into their parish. But even if you leave it in your car, it'll show up on the property. It's worse than we think. Did you see that? I don't know if you used this on your show or not, but there was that footage from right after the Super Bowl. There was Philadelphia. There was a mass being said, and there was the priest and the altar servers were processing out, and his deacon, pretty sure it was his deacon, was wearing his clericals. And
Yeah,
had,
with
like,
a
the
number on
Philadelphia logo on it. Yeah,
Right.
Did
Yeah.
you notice that parish was mostly empty? There was almost nobody there.
No, I didn't.
There was like 2 people per pew.
It's bizarre.
Yeah.
We live in bizarre times. They don't preach the gospel. They don't enforce the commandments. They enforce their liberal agenda, their modernist liberal agenda. And I would love to say that Catholics are just kind of getting fed up with the politicized, agendized gospel that gets fed down our throats. The materialism, the consumerism, the secularism of wearing that jersey, alb at Mass. It's like, this cheapens the gospel. Our Lord died on a cross to save souls, and you're just like, go Eagles. Hey, I'm glad the Eagles beat the Chiefs. Don't get me wrong. Praise be to God. I think it was a good lesson for Taylor Swift to learn that. Good humility for her. Praise be to Jesus. But I felt bad that poor Harrison Butker had to learn it the hard way. But nonetheless, that music means we're out of time. Dr. Anthony Stine, if you can hang out with us, we'd like to continue our conversation in the after show. I'm going to put links to everything we discussed today in the show notes. But let me just one last reminder. Vatican is a walled city with thick, high walls. And no, you're not allowed to illegally immigrate there. No, you're not allowed to cross their borders without being invited and having permission. It doesn't work that way. And no, they don't take any illegal immigrants from any third world country who are suffering in any way, shape, or form. Let us pray for common sense and the gospel of Jesus.
Did you like that video? It's okay. You can admit it. It's perfectly fine. Hey, we cover the big stories of our day, from inside the church to outside the church to all points in between, and we do it from a Catholic perspective. It's called A Catholic Take. It's a radio program Monday through Friday. We live stream it right here on this channel, by the way, so make sure to subscribe, like, and share. We would be very grateful to you. And don't forget, you're going to want to watch this video right here because you don't want to miss anything.